I had never been one to let emotions cloud my judgment, but living with Ethan, my straight roommate, was starting to push the limits of what I could control. He was the epitome of everything I admired: confident, effortlessly charming, and completely unaware of the turmoil that simmered beneath the surface whenever he smiled or laughed. His casual nature made him an easy person to live with, and his friendship was something I had come to depend on. But somewhere along the way, those small moments, the ones that most people would brush off, began to mean something more to me. It was an ordinary Thursday evening when it all began to unravel. The apartment smelled of fresh pasta sauce, a comforting aroma that had become part of the background of my life. Ethan was in the kitchen, humming softly as he chopped vegetables. I sat at the counter, pretending to scroll through my phone, but really, I was watching him, his movements so familiar, so effortlessly graceful. Every shift of his arm as he reached for the salt, the way his laughter filled the space like sunlight breaking through clouds, it was all a constant reminder of how out of my depth I had become. Our apartment was a small two-bedroom in the heart of the city, far enough from campus to escape the hustle, but close enough to remain tethered to it. It was nothing special: worn carpet, chipped paint, but it had become our home. Ethan had moved in 6 months ago, a random decision fueled by the need to escape his family's overbearing presence and live a bit more freely. He had a girlfriend, Mara, but that never seemed to interfere with his carefree attitude. I never thought much about their relationship. After all, they were a match made in what seemed like a textbook romance. But in the quiet moments of the night, when the apartment was silent except for the hum of the fridge, my mind would wander, tracing lines between us that I knew I shouldn't. "Dinner's almost ready," Ethan called over his shoulder, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. I nodded, my fingers still tapping absent-mindedly on my phone, though I wasn't reading anything. The truth was, I couldn't remember the last time I had truly been present in a conversation, or even in my own thoughts. I was too consumed by a single unshakable question. Did he ever feel the same way? That evening, as we sat down to eat, I felt the weight of the question pressing harder. Ethan was animated as usual, recounting some ridiculous thing that had happened at work, but I could barely focus. He leaned in, laughing louder than necessary, his eyes bright with mischief. For a split second, our faces were too close, and I could smell his cologne, the faintest hint of cedar and musk. It sent a rush through my chest, a confusing, almost painful sensation that I couldn't quite place. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "You okay?" Ethan asked, pausing mid-laugh, his brow furrowing with concern. I snapped back to reality, nodding quickly. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." He didn't push it. Ethan never did. He had this way of making you feel like you were always welcome, no matter how distant you were. It was a trait that made him a good roommate, but it also made everything more complicated. I wasn't just falling for him. I was falling for the ease with which he made me feel seen, even if I wasn't being entirely honest with him. The nights we spent playing video games, sharing music, or even just talking about life felt like threads weaving us closer. Yet I knew they were only illusions, fragile connections that I could never truly act on. Later that night, after dinner, we settled into the living room. Ethan grabbed his guitar, strumming aimlessly as I flipped through a magazine, my thoughts racing. We didn't speak much. There was no need to. But I could feel the space between us shifting, like the atmosphere had thickened. I watched him play, his fingers moving effortlessly over the strings. And for the first time, I wondered if he could see the way I looked at him, or if he was too lost in his own world to notice. The hours passed, and before I knew it, it was time for bed. I excused myself, heading to my room as I tried to quiet the nervous energy swirling inside me. I changed into my pajamas, my reflection in the mirror making me pause. I looked like the same person I'd always been, but tonight I felt different. Maybe it was the tension, or maybe it was the growing realization that I couldn't keep pretending that I was just fine with our friendship being all there was. I switched off the light, letting the darkness settle in, and climbed into bed. But just as I began to drift into sleep, I heard the faintest noise. The creak of the floorboards, the soft rustling of the blankets. My heart skipped, but I told myself it was nothing, just the apartment settling, just the usual sounds. But then, the door to my room slowly creaked open. It was Ethan. He didn't say a word. He simply walked in, and as I sat up, he sat next to me on the bed. The room felt charged in a way I couldn't explain. The silence between us hung thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else entirely, something I wasn't prepared for. "What's going on, man?" I finally asked, my voice rough with uncertainty. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he met my gaze, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, something I couldn't quite understand. And then, just like that, he did something I never expected. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and the remnants of an unsettling dream clinging to my thoughts. I lay in bed for a few moments, struggling to piece together what had happened. But it was all a blur, except for one thing. Ethan, the memory of his presence in my room last night, sitting there, so close yet so distant, gnawed at my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us, even though nothing had been spoken aloud. I forced myself to get up, the weight of uncertainty pressing on my chest as I moved toward the kitchen. The sun had barely risen, casting pale light through the blinds, and the apartment was quiet. Ethan was usually an early riser, but there was no sign of him yet. It was strange, almost eerie, not hearing the usual hum of his morning routine. Music blaring, pots clanging, his carefree chatter as he brewed his coffee. I shook my head, trying to clear the lingering fog of last night, but a part of me couldn't let go of the question. Why had he come in? Why hadn't he said anything? As I poured myself a cup of coffee, the silence in the apartment seemed heavier than usual. I looked around, as if expecting Ethan to walk in any second, grinning sheepishly and making some offhand joke to break the tension. But nothing. Only the steady drip of the coffee machine filled the void. Minutes later, the front door clicked open. I heard footsteps in the hallway, and a moment later, Ethan appeared in the kitchen. His hair was slightly messy, his shirt wrinkled, like he hadn't bothered to change since the night before. He didn't look at me right away, instead heading straight for the fridge to grab a bottle of water. I noticed the faint bags under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept well, either. But even in his disheveled state, there was something magnetic about him. His presence still managed to fill the room with a warmth that made everything else fade away. "Hey," he finally said, his voice rough, like he had been awake for hours. "You sleep okay?" I nodded, but my mind was racing. I wanted to ask him what had happened last night. Why he'd come in without saying anything, why it felt like something had shifted. But the words stuck in my throat. I wasn't sure if I was ready to confront him, or if I was just afraid of the answer. "Yeah, I'm fine," I replied, forcing a smile, hoping he wouldn't notice the tension. But I could feel him watching me, his eyes calculating, as if he was trying to figure me out. It made me feel exposed, like he could see right through me. For a long moment, we stood there in silence, the air thick with unspoken words. I wanted to break it, to ask him about last night, to ask if he remembered what happened. But I couldn't. My heart was pounding too loudly, and I was afraid that if I said anything, the fragile equilibrium between us would shatter. Ethan took a sip from his bottle, then placed it down on the counter. "I know this is weird," he said, his voice suddenly quieter, "but I think we need to talk." I froze. My stomach dropped. There it was, the moment I had been dreading. I couldn't tell if this conversation would be the beginning of something new or the end of everything I had carefully built with him. I had no idea where this would lead, but I knew one thing for certain. It wasn't going to be easy. "Yeah," I muttered, my voice barely a whisper. "We do." Ethan looked down for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "Last night, I don't know what came over me," he said slowly. "I shouldn't have come in. I shouldn't have," his words faltered, like he wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. I'm not sure what I'm feeling." I stared at him, trying to process what he had just said. Part of me wanted to demand an explanation, to know what he meant, but another part of me wanted to run. The air between us was charged, and I wasn't sure if it was something that could be fixed. I could feel the weight of his words sinking in, their implications spiraling out of control in my mind. "I don't know what happened either," I said finally, my voice trembling slightly. "But I think we need to figure this out." Whatever this is. Ethan nodded, his gaze shifting toward the window, like he was searching for something outside. I've never been good with these kinds of things, he muttered, more to himself than to me. I don't know how to handle all of this. It's like everything's changed overnight. The words hung in the air, unspoken, but understood. And as I stood there, staring at him, I realized that everything had changed. This moment, this quiet exchange in the morning light, had torn down the walls I had built around my feelings. The space between us felt impossibly small now, and I wasn't sure whether to run away from it or let myself fall. I think we need time, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Time to figure out what this means. For both of us. Ethan nodded again, his face still unreadable, but there was something different in his eyes. Something soft, vulnerable, like he was waiting for me to make the next move. I wasn't sure what that move would be, but I knew I couldn't back away now. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with shadows and unanswered questions, but it was the only path I could see. And so, with one last shared glance, we both knew that this was only the beginning. The days after that conversation felt like a delicate dance between us, both of us stepping around the silence that had formed. The apartment, once filled with the hum of casual conversation and laughter, had grown strangely quiet. There were moments when I caught Ethan's eyes lingering on me, but he would quickly look away, as if afraid I might see too much. I tried to act normal, to pretend like nothing had shifted, but it was impossible. The tension between us was thick, and it felt like we were both walking on a tightrope, each afraid to make a misstep. I threw myself into my work, hoping that if I stayed busy enough, the thoughts that gnawed at me would fade. But every time I came home, the familiar smell of Ethan's cologne in the air, the soft rustle of his footsteps in the hallway, reminded me that things weren't the same. That night, I found myself in the kitchen alone, trying to distract myself with a late-night snack. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each passing second stretching the unease between us. Then, the door creaked open, and Ethan stepped into the room. He was wearing an old t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair still damp from a shower. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just stood there, as if trying to find the words. I turned around to face him, but my stomach tightened as soon as our eyes met. I think we need to talk, Ethan said quietly, his voice unsteady. I swallowed hard. The words I had been dreading, the words that had been hanging in the air between us for days, were finally being spoken aloud. A part of me wanted to run, to escape this conversation before it could consume me, but another part of me, the part that had been waiting for this moment, was already bracing myself. Okay, I replied, my voice softer than I meant it to be. Ethan hesitated, then stepped closer to me, his gaze never leaving mine. I can't stop thinking about what happened that night, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know what it was, but it felt like something shifted between us, and I need to know if you feel it too. I was frozen. His words were like a jolt to my system, each one adding weight to the tension that had been hanging in the air. Did I feel it too? Of course I did. I had never felt more exposed in my life, but I was terrified to admit it aloud. The truth was I didn't know how to respond. I had spent so long trying to convince myself that nothing had changed, that it was just a fluke, a moment of weakness. But standing in front of Ethan, I realized that I couldn't keep pretending. I do, I said, my voice barely audible. I feel it. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid between us. Ethan's expression softened, and for a brief moment, I saw something raw in his eyes, something vulnerable, something that made my heart skip a beat. I don't know what to do with this, he confessed, his hands trembling slightly as he ran them through his hair. I'm not sure what it means, but I can't ignore it anymore. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions that was threatening to overwhelm me. Maybe we shouldn't try to figure it out right away, I suggested, my voice more confident than I felt. Maybe we need time to process everything. Ethan nodded slowly, but there was a hesitation in his eyes, like he wasn't sure if time would help or just make things worse. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words died on his lips. Instead, he took a step back, his gaze shifting away from me. I don't want to lose you, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm afraid that this, whatever it is, will ruin everything. I don't know how to fix it." I felt a pang in my chest. The honesty in his words hit me harder than I expected. Ethan wasn't just worried about what this could mean for us. He was afraid of what it could cost. I could see the fear in his eyes, the fear that I had been carrying all along but hadn't been able to admit. The fear that whatever we had, our friendship, our trust, could be shattered by a single wrong move. "I don't want to lose you either," I replied, my voice trembling. "But I think we need to be honest with each other. We can't keep pretending like nothing's happened." For a long time, we stood there in silence, the weight of our words settling between us. I could feel the space between us closing, but it wasn't a comforting closeness. It was charged, filled with uncertainty and unresolved emotions. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between us, but I didn't know how. I didn't know if there was a way back from this, or if we were already too far gone. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice breaking the silence. "I need some time," he said, his words tinged with regret. I need to figure out what this all means." I nodded, my throat tight. "Me too," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "I'll give you space. I just don't know what happens next." Ethan gave me a small, uncertain smile, then turned and left the kitchen without another word. I stood there, staring at the empty space he had left behind, trying to make sense of everything. My heart ached, but I didn't know if it was from fear or longing. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same between us again. As I stood there in the quiet apartment, the weight of our conversation pressing on me, I couldn't help but wonder, was this the beginning of something new, or the end of everything we had built? And, most importantly, could we ever go back?